This is not going to end well. We have an interception of Russian warplanes by NATO aircraft over NATO territory. And given everything else that has happened recently, it is worth trying to understand what exactly the Kremlin might be trying to bait out of Brussels, and how it might reflect some unobserved weaknesses in Russia's war-fighting capabilities. Yes, 3 MiG-31 fighters like this one traveled over Estonian airspace for 12 minutes earlier today. This is the third incident now in 9 days that NATO has faced. First, with about 20 Shahed-style decoy drones crossing into Poland on September 10th, and then more drones flying over Poland and Romania on September 14th. Well, add this one to the list, all with the backdrop of a broader proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, and a more recent backdrop of Russia engaged in a large-scale military exercise in Belarus. I am recording these words only hours after the incident happened. Keep that in mind, as many of the details are still missing. Despite that, I will try my best to explain what seems to have occurred and what the deeper ramifications here are. And I know that there is a temptation here to shoot first and ask questions later. But let's pause for a moment and work through some of the possibilities. First though, what actually happened? Remember that we are looking at 3 fighters here. The aircraft did not fly over Estonian land, so let's reset them. Rather, they flew over Estonian territorial waters, which would implicitly mean somewhere around here, somewhere over the Gulf of Finland. Keep that in mind, as it will become important later. But, just as important, this lasted 12 minutes. You know exactly the narrative that we will hear out of the Kremlin when they wake up over in Moscow. Either these were not Russian aircraft, or that this was just some big misunderstanding. Well, let's ignore the idea that these were not Russian aircraft. Thing is, it is hard to make an authentic mistake for 12 minutes, especially when the fighters had their transponders off, and especially when NATO intercepted the fighters. What we do not yet know are the details of how exactly they were intercepted, but that is beside the point. To compound the level of suspicion, imagine for a moment that Russia had made an honest mistake a couple of other times over the past week or so. What kind of posture would the Kremlin now want to take? Probably one of excess caution. NATO is already suspicious of you. To have another incident in such a short period of time will convert all remaining skeptics into believers, and you will have a bigger problem on your hands. Or, alternatively, you are looking for a bigger problem on your hands, and all of this is intentional. You be the judge of which seems more plausible. We also do not yet know how NATO plans to coordinate a response to this. It could be another Article 4 situation, and it would be the shortest amount of time between Article 4 invocations in history, beating Turkey's successive calls in June and October 2012 by a huge margin. And, indeed, Estonia has called for Article 4 consultations. This is interesting because, on the face of it, another round of consultations would appear to be superfluous. Following the initial drone incursion in Poland, NATO announced Operation Eastern Sentry as its way to bulk up defenses in the region. Estonia is included in the eastern flank covered under the protection plan, so invoking Article 4 again would seem to be redundant. The inference we are left to draw is that Estonia does not think that Eastern Sentry goes far enough, perhaps especially now that Russian fighters have entered the picture. We are no longer dealing with drones here. But that will have to wait for the morning in Brussels for us to figure this out. But speaking of Eastern Sentry, while the Russian MiG-31s were penetrating Estonian airspace, French fighters were deploying to NATO's eastern flank as a part of the program. These here were heading to Poland specifically, but you get the point. And let's stick with this B-roll for a minute, as I explain an important difference between what happened in Estonia versus Poland. And I should point out that such actions may already be in the works, but are not public as a part of operational security. We instead only hear about the strictly defensive parts because they are publicly observable and provide some reassurance to those on the ground. The upshot for Poland is that Shahed-style decoys are not much of a kinetic threat. Yes, they can still crash or be destroyed, and have their debris smash into property, or humans for that matter. But they are not going to cause massive booms. On the other hand, the MiGs in Estonia are a different story. These are strike aircraft, which means they can, strike things. Nonetheless, the difference runs in both directions. A MiG-31 costs tens of millions of dollars and has human pilots, meaning that if you shoot one down, the Kremlin has to absorb a significant loss. And we know what the template for this looks like. We just discussed it in my last video, when Turkey shot down a Russian Su-24 in 2015, killing its pilot in the process. And yet, Russia did virtually nothing of consequence in response. Side note, there was a bizarre number of comments on that video that Russia did in fact respond by killing 34 Turkish soldiers. I think it is worth pointing out that the response occurred in 2020, and in my professional opinion, the only way that a response that happens 5 years after the fact could truly qualify as a response is if the two parties live 2.5 light years away from each other. Well, I did the math, and it takes 0.006 seconds for light to travel between Moscow and Ankara. So, no, that was not a response. Just a separate military action and another incident where Article 4 was invoked. It seems impossible to get away from that provision at this point. Anyway, point is, Russia did not want to get involved in a broader conflict with Turkey, and so all sorts of red lines passed without significant consequences. Turkey's strategy of a Vulcan hello worked to perfection. That said, this is not a good template to battle Russia with drones over Poland, because downing a drone matters little to anyone in the Kremlin, but it costs the West a lot. Put those two things together, and the Kremlin would love that process to continue without end. But the Estonia incident is a different story. Here, there are valuable Russian assets on the line. If you want to deter a repeat of that behavior, destroying them is a reasonable option. Indeed, compared to the 2015 incident with Turkey, Russia is in a substantially worse position. The Kremlin cannot simultaneously sustain a war in Ukraine with a separate game of chicken over NATO skies. And that ought to give some confidence to NATO countries that shooting down a Russian craft does not automatically trigger World War III. Along those lines, I think it is worth speculating on what Russia's motivation may be here. As background, the Kremlin is hamstrung on its war recruitment, because Russian citizens do not have much of an appetite for the war. Those who are joining have an appetite for money, however, and that is how the Kremlin can keep sending fresh meat to the front line. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has tried really hard to frame the war in Ukraine as a war against NATO, that NATO is a threat to all Russians, and so all Russians should support the war effort. Once again, that message has not been as effective as the Kremlin would like it to be. There is still enough information transparency in Russia that any skeptical Russian can look online and realize that it is a proxy battle and not much else. Hence why the Kremlin cannot institute another mass mobilization without causing significant political problems. So, here is a theory. The Kremlin wants one of these planes shot down. The Kremlin will then claim that the plane was innocent of any breach of territory that NATO claims. Instead, this is just a NATO disinformation campaign to hide the real truth, that NATO is an aggressor, and that now is the time for all Russians to support the war effort. The Kremlin then turns around and uses all of that support not to defeat NATO, because continuing with that engagement would be an even bigger blunder than getting involved in a land war in Asia. No, all of it gets pointed at Ukraine, because that is where the Kremlin's real priorities lie. If so, then there are still some more conservative routes that NATO could pursue, that would nevertheless impose significant damage on Russia. Remember how I mentioned the Gulf of Finland before? Well, it is an arm of the Baltic Sea, and there is a joke that Sweden and Finland's entries into the alliance a couple of years ago turned it into a NATO lake. Indeed, other than Kaliningrad, there is only this small section of coastline that is not owned by a NATO member. What that means is that it is relatively feasible to engage in some type of de facto embargo of the Russian ports there. This is notable because it is pretty far north, and therefore an outlet for Russian energy reserves at that latitude. If some countries wanted to, they could start heavily regulating the traffic that runs through there, including the shadow fleet that runs oil to China and India. The war continues because Russia can afford to pay for it. Cut the outlet for the oil to those countries, and Russia has to rethink what it is doing. Heck, you do not even need to formally seize the vessels. Just slow them down, make sure that all of their paperwork is in order, they have proper insurance, and that they are not dragging their anchors to cut undersea cables. The reason that delays like this would cause such an issue is because tanker supply is what constrains Russian exports. If all you do is add an extra day to every Shadow Fleet tanker's journey, Russia cannot just charter additional vessels to take the oil that begins to pile up at the harbor. Those additional vessels do not exist. There is also an analog to the offensive solution to Poland's problem. The cost ratio of drones to drone defense goes away if you simply blow up all of Russia's drone factories. And if you do not want to do that yourself, you can just hand long-range weapons to Ukraine, give Ukraine the coordinates, and let Ukraine press the button. The analog here is that Ukraine is already targeting the port along the Baltic Sea as a part of its counter-energy campaign. This is a true version of kinetic sanctions. You could just step those things up as well. And I guess that is what is most puzzling about the last 9 days. There is a lot of talk about how these are various tests to NATO's resolve. Yeah, sure, that is true on some level. But where exactly does the Kremlin think that this is going to go? I can imagine a world where NATO decides to just turtle up and not order any direct responses. One, because of the Kremlin persuasion campaign that I discussed earlier, and two, because the whole World War III concern still lingers in the back of the minds of many. However, on the grand scheme of things, Russian actions so far are bug bites. Meanwhile, Russia the country is losing figurative appendages in Ukraine, and certainly its soldiers in Ukraine are losing appendages. There is no world where NATO sits back and does literally nothing in response to these actions, especially when the targets are Poland and Estonia, two of the most anti-Russian members of the alliance. Or maybe the two most anti-Russian members. I don't know. It is not like they sit around in Brussels doing 32-team power rankings in order of how much they loathe Russia. The minimum consequence that this will result in is a bigger check handed to Ukraine, which is kind of crazy to think about. For decades, European defense spending languished. Now it pops. Props to Putin. And the European economies are way, way larger than Russia's economy. This is not a winning battle for Moscow. Best case scenario for the Kremlin is that the war ends in an even worse Pyrrhic victory. Worst case scenario is that Russia is so enfeebled by the situation that Russian troops cannot hold their ground. Well, no. The worst case scenario is that the silliness results in World War III. What a happy thought. Now, speaking of happy thoughts, why not take a look at these two awesome books about the war? Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.